It's nice to see so many people here. I think we have more people in the lecture tonight than at the movies. I think I scared some of you by saying the movie was 2 hours and 15 minutes long, which it was. And so some of you might have decided to watch it at the comfort of your own apartment. Judy is not here, so I will not imitate Judy by saying, well, this is our Rabbi, Dr. Panitz, you all know him. So I will actually go through a very short introduction, though most of you indeed do know him. Rabbi Dr. Michael Panitz was trained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was ordained as rabbi in 1982 and received a PhD in Jewish history in 1989. Michael Panitz combines both specialties in his professional career. He has served as rabbi of Temple Israel in Norfolk since 1992. You must be doing something right that they may still have you. Active in the field of adult Jewish education, he has taught for the Jewish Community Center of Tidewater, the Jewish Museum and Cultural Center of Portsmouth, and many synagogues. He has been an adjunct professor of religious studies, history, and Hebrew language at local colleges and universities, William and Mary from 96 to 99, Virginia Wesleyan University 1999 until today, well, presumably also tomorrow, until present it says, and Old Dominion University 2007, also until present. Rabbi Panitz is committed to ecumenical dialogue and programming. For the past decade, he has served as a rabbi in residence at Christ and St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Norfolk, preaching and teaching there regularly. He has taught at approximately a dozen churches in Southampton Roads, the Eastern Shore, and North Carolina. Prior to arriving in Norfolk, Rabbi Panitz was a faculty member at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and served a congregation in New Jersey. Rabbi Panitz contributes articles to scholarly journals on Jewish subjects. Michael and Sheila Panitz have been married since 1978. Their larger family includes, this may have to be updated, but I read what we wrote down 2 years ago, includes their 3 children, spouses, and 5 grandchildren, ranging in age from upper teens to infancy. On a personal note, Michael and I got to know each other about 12 years ago, not 25 years ago. But we are together in a group called Theophilus, which is a group of both clergy and laity coming together once a month to discuss topics of common interest, usually with a theological bent of looking at our common scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, but also having topics of New Testament scholarship, as well as contemporary topics like chaplaincy or the topic of anti-Judaism and so forth. So it's a pleasure to have him here quite frequently, and indeed, it is our most favorite rabbi, Reverend Dr. Michael Panitz. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening, friends. Because of the slight irregularity in our schedule last month, it turns out that I was here only 2 weeks ago, and now I'm here again. So it's very nice to see you with at least a higher frequency than we sometimes have. Quick show of hands, as I often ask for a show of hands. Who has seen the film that I'll be discussing? So most everyone. All right. To remind you of our general theme, we're examining films that, when taken cumulatively, can give us an overview of the history of the Jewish people and also the Jewish religion. Now, any one film fits into that overall purpose in various ways. One of our films was a documentary. We studied about Masada. One of our films was a Hollywood romance. That was the Ivanhoe film. This film is a musical. And it's a musical designed to showcase the considerable singing talents of Barbra Streisand. You probably know her from other roles where she's really sung up a storm, right? I dare say you haven't seen her dressed as a man in other films, though. So I'd like you to keep in mind three different related but separate facts. One is the set of facts of the society that is depicted in this film. The society of Jews living in Russia and Poland under the oppressive rule of the Tsar of Russia prior to World War I. That's the history piece that I want to explain to you. The second of the three foci is the short story Yentl, the religious studies lad, written by a Nobel Prize winning Yiddish language author named Isaac Bashevis Singer. And he wrote the story in the 1950s, and I'll be telling you a little bit about that. And the third focus is the film that we've watched, which had a long period of gestation between, say, the 1960s and 1980s, very much the passion project of Barbra Streisand herself. So we're trying to keep in mind these three different overlapping points of focus. I'll start with the history this time, not the film. All four of my grandparents hailed from that part of the world. My father's father was born in a tiny little hamlet in north central Poland and emigrated to this country as a 19-year-old in the year 1910. His wife, my paternal grandmother, was born in a tiny little hamlet in the western Ukraine. At various parts of history, it was part of Poland, it was part of Ukraine, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Same little place, but the political borders kept on shifting. Came to this country at about the same time, 19-teens. My mother's father was born not far from Riga, Latvia. Again, all tiny little villages. Came to this country circa 1912. And my mother's mother was born in Belarus and came to this country as a teenager. Thank you. In 1913. They were part of an immense wave of migration. Approximately 2 to 3 million Jewish people fled Tsarist Russia, really going wherever they could. Sometimes they'd go wherever they could get a steamship ticket, because back then that's how one traveled, by steamship. And most of them traveled in what was called steerage, which is the malodorous, unhealthy bottom part of the steamship. You know, while the first class passengers are enjoying, luxury and wonderful table service and musicians playing, Viennese waltzes for them, the passengers in steerage were, being nauseous for 11 days straight until they glimpsed, well, it's her right arm, they glimpsed the Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty, holding up her golden torch, right? You might remember that the poem that graces the base of the Statue of Liberty was written by an American Jewish woman poet named Emma Lazarus. And you may even remember that it was set to music. Give me your tired, your poor, your wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send them all to me. Right? I lift my lamp beyond the golden door. Not exactly the motto of contemporary ICE agents, I would have to say. Not exactly that same welcome to fellow humans who are desperately trying to escape oppression. My grandparents were desperately trying to escape oppression. The Russian Tsar had anti-Semitism as a state policy. It involved the punitive use of the army to draft Jewish teenagers and hold them in barbaric conditions for 25 years, designed to coerce them into converting. One typical treatment of Jewish draftees would be to feed them only salted herring and deny them all water. But if they would convert, they would get water. That's what the conscription in the Tsar's army meant during peacetime, as opposed to being cannon fodder during wartime. Many Jewish parents, many Jewish mothers, like the mother of Moses in the book of Exodus, concealed the births of their baby sons as long as possible, hoping that the boys would be actually a year or two older than their stated age, so that when they emigrated to America or Canada or Mexico or Argentina or Scotland or England or Ireland or France or Germany, when they emigrated away from the oppressive rule of the Tsar, maybe they would be 16 instead of 14 or 17 instead of 15 and have slightly more chance of making it in that foreign world with no social support network. There was no welfare for them to apply to. They would go there and they would most likely be working in what we call sweatshops within days. I grew up in an industrial city in northern New Jersey. Some of you may have heard of it. It was called Paterson, New Jersey. Paterson, New Jersey was noted for its textile mills. It produced a lot of textiles. And many of the workers who migrated from places like Bialystok, Russia, or Lodz, Poland, to America went to Paterson because they were working in the same textile mills with the same factory equipment as they'd been working on in the factory towns of Eastern Europe. So even before they knew any English, they knew how to operate the machinery, and they were working 12-hour days or 14-hour days in Poland, and they were working 12 or 14-hour days in America. It was brutal. But in America, there was at least the chance to better oneself, at least the opportunity. The streets were not paved with gold. That was the pipe dream, right? By the way, there's an animated film. I don't know if you ever saw it, or maybe you showed it to children or grandchildren, called Fievel Mouskowitz. Did you ever see the film? It tells the story of these Eastern European immigrants to America in an animated film where the hero, the protagonist, is a mouse. His name is Fievel. Fievel is like Phoebe or Phoebus. And his last name is not the famous Jewish name Moskowitz, but Mouskowitz. So when the whole family of Fievel's mice relatives are in steerage in this boat, rocking back and forth, they're trying to keep their spirits up, so they sing a song. There are no cats in America, and the streets are paved with cheese. which is a fictional mouse way of saying there are no anti-Semites in America, and the streets are paved with gold. Well, there were anti-Semites in America, and the streets were not paved with gold. But compared to Russia, it was much, much better. And so of the 5 million Jews who were living in Tsarist Russian Empire in 1880, over 2 million of them left by the First World War. And yet, the families were large in those days. It wasn't unusual for a married couple to have 6, 7, 8 children. And so 5 million Jewish subjects, oppressed subjects of the Tsar in 1880, 2+ million left, still 5 million in 1920, because they were large families. What happened to those 5 million? Well, many were killed in the First World War, in the fighting which raged just in that part of where they lived. You might remember that we were fixated on what was called the Western Front, which trench warfare running from the North Sea to the Swiss border, diagonally across France. You might remember the very powerful anti-war story, All Quiet on the Western Front, by Erich Maria Remarque, very famous book and novel, and movie. But there was also an Eastern Front, where the Germans and the Austrians were fighting against the Russians. And the Germans won that part of the First World War. We remember that they lost and were dealt a very harsh treaty at the Treaty of Versailles, but they won in the East. And they dealt a very harsh treaty to the Russians, by the way. It was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So that area was where Jewish people lived, and many were killed in the fighting. Many were killed in pogroms by Russian troops who immediately assumed that they would be fifth columnists, siding with the Germans and the Austrians. Because this is not Nazi Germany, this is Wilhelmine Germany. It was not anti-Semitic in the same way. So the Jews were kind of like hoping that the Germans would win, but they weren't actively being seditious, but that didn't stop the Russian troops killing them. And then there was a civil war after the communist revolution in Russia in 1917. There was a full-fledged civil war between communists and anti-communists and Polish partisans of Polish independence. And all 3 armies were engaged in pogroms against the Jews. They had no place to turn. And the worst of all, of course, was the Nazi invasion. First of Poland in 1939, and then of the Soviet Union in 1941. The Nazis had special killing squads who were called Einsatzgruppen that went through just behind the Wehrmacht armies, and they rounded up and they massacred hundreds of thousands of Jews. Maybe 1.5 million Jews all told. A Holocaust of bullets. So my grandparents, who could know the future? But when I would go to the airport in the 1990s and I would meet Jewish families fleeing after the fall of the Soviet Union, and I would greet them and welcome them to Virginia, we'd settle them in, and they would say to me, "Your grandparents were the smart ones. They left in the 19-teens before all these other bad things could happen." So, for all the Hollywood, I don't know if you know the word kitsch, for all the Hollywood kitsch that you see in the movie, it is the story of my grandparents' generation. Now, in this world, the world of Poland and Russia before 1914, not every Jewish person was traditionally pious. Some had moved to the cities, some had become communists because they were looking for better working conditions. They were in the labor movements. And you might know that communism was officially atheist. You should check if the copy machine isn't a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. it's possible that it is, because the copying machine here always fails us just on the day that I'm giving my lecture. So maybe it's an atheist communist and that's its protest. But a majority of the Jews in Tsarist Russia were still traditionally Orthodox Jews. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes and describe that for you. Jews did not have a state of their own. From the time that the Romans destroyed the Jewish kingdom in the year 70 of this common era and destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, until the state of Israel was proclaimed in the year 1948. For all that time, what kept the Jewish people cohesive? What allowed them not simply to assimilate out of existence? They were a tiny minority wherever they lived. The answer is that their fierce loyalty to their religious traditions allowed them to sustain a kind of an internal autonomy, as it were, even though they had no real independence. So, in an emotional sense, their world was very much inward looking. Of course, there were relations with the outside world. There had to be. They had to pay taxes. They had to interact economically with the outside world, but their center of gravity was internal. And that meant that all the orthodox strictness of Jewish law was fully present for these Jews of Russia in a way which was scarcely replicated in America at that time. Even Orthodox Jews in America weren't as strict as these people in the world that we were looking at in the film. Now, part of that was a rather strict sense of gender roles. Did anyone ever see the musical Fiddler on the Roof? So there's a song at the beginning of Fiddler on the Roof, Tradition, Tradition. And the four different singers are the papas, the mamas, the sons, the daughters. So the papas, who day and night must scramble for a living, feed a wife and children, earn his daily bread, right? That's the papas. But they also at least pretend that they have the last word at home. At least the women allow them to pretend that they have the last word at home. And then there are the mamas, right, who are in charge of making the household run. And then there's the sons who sing, at 3 I started Hebrew school, at 10 I learned a trade. I hear they picked a bride for me. I hope she's pretty. They didn't get to choose their own mates. It was done by a marriage broker. And then the daughters, who grows up helping mama to mend and tend and cook, right? Preparing me to marry whomever papa chooses. The daughters. Of course, that's also a musical, but it's traditional roles. So our story is about someone who defies those traditional roles. And we should realize that there were very, very, very few people who did that. So the story is not accurate in that sense. It's looking at someone who is a bit of an outsider. So now I'm going to segue to talk about the story and its author. And in fact, the story is worth reading quite independently of the film. The story, Yentl, the yeshiva boy, the yeshiva lad, was written by one of the greatest 20th century Jewish authors. His name was Isaac Bashevis Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R. He grew up in Warsaw, Poland. In other words, his family had already left the tiny villages and moved to the big city, already in the 1800s. And he grew up in this intensely religiously pious world, but his eyes were looking for broader horizons. And he emigrated to New York City. A gifted writer, but you know, it's not easy to make a living as a gifted writer. It's not even easy to make a living as a non-gifted writer. So what does one do? Well, he found work as a journalist. And he wrote for the largest circulation Yiddish language newspaper that served millions of readers in his early days. It was called the Jewish Daily Forward. It was a newspaper which goes back to the late 1800s, founded in New York City by one of the pioneering Jews who came from Tsarist Russia to settle in New York. And that newspaper tried to help the new immigrants to get their feet planted in this new country. Do you know how sometimes in newspapers there are advice columns? Dear Abby, those sorts of things. Right? So there was an advice column in the Jewish Daily Forward that the editor himself, whose name was Abraham Kahan, did we do the movie Yentl or no? The movie Hester Street?
Yes.
So Abraham Kahan wrote the story that became the movie Hester Street.
Oh, okay.
So he himself was a short story author, but mostly a newspaper editor. And he would give people all sorts of psychologically savvy advice about the very real problems of life that they were facing in the New World. So Yentl is a creation of the fertile mind of this novelist and journalist named Isaac Bashevis Singer. He was drawn to people who are somewhat in the margins of their society. They live law-abiding conventional lives, but in their minds they're somewhere else. So one of his novels has a man ultimately decide to live in a house where he's voluntarily self-imprisoned. He puts himself under house arrest because he wants to control his sexual passions. So that way he knows he won't stray. That just to give you a sense of some of the stories that this man thought up. I'll tell you two of his most famous stories, just it'll give you a taste of it. One of them is called The Spinoza of Market Street. That's his most famous story. Now you might know there was a philosopher, a Jewish philosopher in fact, lived in the Netherlands in the 1600s. His name was Benedict Spinoza. He was an arch rationalist, and he was committed to the thought that if only we live by reason and not by our passions, we can not hurt each other. We can have a better world. We can have a more ethical world. He was committed to that. So the Spinoza of Market Street is about an elderly fellow whose life work is to write a commentary on Spinoza's ethics. Now, you don't make a living doing that either. But the Berlin Jewish community gives him a little stipend. And, living in a tiny little attic, garret, one-room apartment, very few needs in life, he survives on his meager allotment from the Berlin Jewish community. Then 1914, the war breaks out, and he's even in greater distress because the war has interrupted that. And somehow he has to leave his little garret, and he finds another place to live where the down the corridor neighbor is a spinster who never got married. And her name is Dobe, and her nickname is Black Dobe, probably because of the color of her teeth. Not a very attractive person on the outside, but she sees in this man, maybe this is the man who will cure my loneliness. So she shows him her trousseau, all the wedding clothing that she never got to wear. And he doesn't know how it happens. He proposes to her. And when they go to bed that night, suddenly he remembers romantic poetry that he memorized 60 years before. Heinrich Heine, romantic poetry, and he starts quoting it to her. Anyway, they both fall asleep. He wakes up before dawn. She's lying in the bed snoring. So, give you a sense of this picture. What have I done? He goes to the window, he opens the window, he looks at the stars twinkling in the sky, totally without passion. And he says, "Divine Spinoza, forgive me. How could I have been such a fool?" That's how the story ends. I'll give you one other story just to give you the flavor of this author. It's called Taibele and Her Demon. Taibele is a very sweet young Jewish woman, and a lot of people didn't live very long back then. She becomes a widow at a young age, young enough that she still has the appetites that a young woman would have, craving a certain amount of intimacy, physical intimacy. And the other person in the story is the town ne'er-do-well, a kind of a, remember the guy from Washington Irving, the one who, the one with the scarecrow, what's the name of that story? It's a Washington Irving story. It's set in the mid-Hudson Valley where, not Uriah, anyway, Ichabod Crane. That's it. He's like a Jewish Ichabod Crane, a total ne'er-do-well. And what does he do for a little bit of enjoyment? He walks last in the procession following all the funerals. That's his idea of something. What's his job? His job is to be the elementary school's assistant to drag the little boys by their ear to get them to school. That's the way he makes a living. So he's really, as we would say in Yiddish, a nebuchal. He's a real ne'er-do-well. So he's following the funeral. Taibele goes home. I don't know how it comes into his head, but that night, no one ever locked their doors. He opens up the bedroom window, comes into her bedroom, slips into her bed. And she awakens with a start, and he says, "Shush, I'm a demon from the underworld. And it's my job to decide what will be the fate of your late husband. So if you're nice to me, we'll be nice to him." She doesn't know what to say, but she certainly wants to do whatever she can to improve the fate of her dear dead husband in the afterworld and not have him suffer all the pains of hell, which this guy is telling her all about, all the terrible things that happen to a sinner in hell, all the ways in which they tickle him mercilessly. I mean, it's not like serious Spanish Inquisition. It's all done very tongue-in-cheek. Guess what? Taibele rather enjoys it. So she pretends that he's forcing her, but he's not. But then she doesn't understand. How come someone who comes from the underworld sometimes has a breath which smells of garlic? How come sometimes in the wintertime his feet are so cold? How can someone who comes from the inferno have cold feet in the wintertime? She never learns who he really is. And the winter comes, and winter pneumonia carried so many people away every winter. And Taibele never understood why the demon just stopped coming to visit her. Some secrets remain buried under the snow. So those are the kinds of stories that this author used to tell. He was very fond of telling stories that are macabre, right? Now, it's never pornographic. Even when he talks about sexy stuff, he never descends into sordid details. But he's very interested in the lives of men and women. That's the kind of stories that he writes. So Yentl, the yeshiva bocher, is one such story. And he thought of what would be the story of a person from this traditional society with its traditional role models, who has, as Bathsheba Singer put it, the body of a woman and the soul of a man. Remembering that only men got to go to seminary, just as is true to this day in the Roman Catholic world, right? Only men become priests. So that's what it was like in the Jewish world as well. Only men studied to become rabbis, not women. This is a woman who craves that higher learning. She would like to learn all the studies that rabbis learn when they become rabbis. And she really wants it. What's more, she's the only child of her father, who was a great scholar, and he taught her. Not having a son, he taught her. You might remember near the beginning of the movie, she burns the fish that she's supposed to make for dinner, and he doesn't complain because no, her mind is not on her cooking, her mind is on her studies, and he's the one who taught her. How could he be angry with her for that? And there's a really beautiful bond between the daughter and the father. In fact, I must say, although there's no singing in the original story, of all the songs that are in the film, where she sings to the soul of her dead father, "Papa, can you hear me?" That's the one song that really moved me the most. "Papa, can you hear me?" Remember how she sang that? I didn't care for all the songs. I like that one very much, though. So in the story, when her father dies, she wants to recite the mourner's prayer for him in his memory. And something you should know about Orthodox Jewish prayer is that public prayers like that are only said with a quorum. I mean, anyone can pray at any time, but public prayers, including the morning prayer, which is a declaration to other people, needs a quorum. And for the Orthodox, the quorum is defined as 10 men, 10 adult men. And in this particular setting, she's at the cemetery, there's only 9 men, and there's her. And they won't let her say the prayer that's in her heart in mourning for her father. So for her, that's a breaking point. And once her father is dead and she doesn't need to be home to take care of him, she dresses as a man and goes to study in a rabbinical seminary. And there were many, many such seminaries in Russia and Poland, because the Jewish people in that era hardly ever went to secular school. They went to traditional schools. Now, how could someone who looks like Barbra Streisand get away with it? The answer is many boys who were precocious, who were studying well beyond their grade level, would go to these higher learning. There was no bar. You could be in a class with older people with no bar, as long as you could understand the material. We once had a television show here about a kid who goes to medical school. Remember Doogie Howser? That was the norm, not the exception in this world of Russia and Poland. If a child was exceptionally bright and could master the level of studies that older teens and 20-somethings were studying, they could sit in class with them. There was no sense that it's developmentally inappropriate. So having a pre-pubescent boy with no beard in that class was by no means strange, as it might be strange to us. So that part of it wasn't surprising. And are there some prepubescent boys who have, gorgeous, beautiful faces? Yes, there are. It happens. So the woman Yentl takes a stereotypically male name. In Yiddish, the name Anshel. Remember in the Bible, there's Adam and Eve, and they have a son named Seth. And Seth has a son named Enosh, right? The Yiddish for Enosh is Enosh, and little Enosh, like Charlie for Charles, is Anshel. So it's a stereotypic male name. So Yentl becomes Anshel, and masquerading herself as Anshel, she goes to study. She loves the study. Her soul thrives in the study. But what happens? In that Jewish world, marriages were always arranged. And parents who respected Jewish learning wanted to have a scholar as a son-in-law. And there was even a pattern where the scholar would marry their daughter at a pretty young age and remain under the roof of the in-laws for maybe 2 years until he finally had to go out and earn a living. So that was part of the traditional Jewish world as well. So Anshel gets married off to the daughter, not in the way that the movie did it, but because that was, how can Anshel turn this down without betraying without betraying who he really is, who she really is? So without actually knowing what happened, Anshel is in a marriage. And of course it's a celibate marriage. Singer was not writing a story about homosexuality. It's a celibate marriage. And how does Anshel get through the wedding night with Hadass? Well, it's not so hard, considering that she knows nothing and he knows nothing. So they managed to get through the night, and nothing times nothing is nothing. And Singer writes all of this with a real tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. If you read the original story, you're just smiling at how ridiculous it is. It's really the theater of the absurd almost. But this is inherently unstable, and it just cannot survive. So eventually what happens is Anshel disappears, leaving his wife Hadass completely bewildered. And he's going to go to some other town, and she's going to go to some other town and repeat the process. It's a story with a sad ending, not the ending of the film at all. Does anyone know the American science fiction author Ray Bradbury? Did you ever read Ray Bradbury? He wrote something called Fahrenheit 451. He also wrote a short story, a hauntingly sad short story about this seeming boy who shows up in town. He looks like a boy, but in fact, he's someone with a rare genetic disorder that, however old he is, he looks like a boy. And he stays in town until people begin whispering, how come he never reaches puberty? And then he just disappears, and he'll show up in the next town. So Ray Bradbury basically wrote the same story as Isaac Bashevis Singer, except that in Singer's story it involves this cross-dressing. And in Bradbury's story, the boy just goes and plays in the Little League baseball team, and he basically finds someone to foster care for him until he can't maintain the charade, and then he disappears and moves on as well. So Singer told this sad story. Now, he published the story in the 1950s. He's already an established novelist and short story author and journalist living and working in New York City. His readership is dwindling because the grandparents' generation, my grandparents, came to America. They spoke Yiddish. Their children, my parents, spoke Yiddish, but not as a first language. My parents spoke Yiddish as a second or third language, not as a first language. And so they weren't buying Yiddish newspapers anymore. They were buying the Boston Globe, they were buying the New York Times, they were buying the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, wherever they were living, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun. That's what they were reading. They weren't reading the Jewish Daily Forward anymore. So Singer's living is evaporating. So I think writing a story with a kind of a bittersweet ending is very much the story of his life. I'll give you one more Singer story just to give you a sense of it. Did you ever see a film or read the novel, Enemies, a Love Story? It's one of Singer's more famous novels. He writes this story about a guy who's a bigamist. He's got a wife in the Bronx, and he's got another wife in Coney Island, in Brooklyn. But what's the real story? The real story is that he's a Holocaust survivor. And the wife in Brooklyn was the Polish Gentile girl who hid him in the family hayloft when the Nazis came looking. And she has a love for him, and he can't not reciprocate that. So the wife in the Bronx thinks that he goes off on business trips. And he does go off on trips, but they're not to Ohio or Indiana or Illinois, they're Coney Island. He always brings back some sort of gift for her, of course. But the story gets complicated because he was convinced that his first wife, the woman, the love of his youth, the one he married back in Poland before the Nazis came in, he was convinced that she was killed by the Nazis because in the maelstrom of the war, they lost track of each other. What happens when she shows up? Now this bigamist is a trigamist. But the first wife, it turns out, is a managerial genius. And she organizes the other two women, and they have this whole system for taking care of this guy who's he's had a total nervous breakdown by now. So anyway, that's a typical Singer story. Enemy is a love story. You might actually enjoy that. That's a movie as well. So now, Barbra Streisand falls in love with this story, Yentl, the yeshiva lad. Yeshiva means parochial school. Yentl, the parochial school lad. And she takes 20 years almost to try to turn it into a film. She goes through maybe 20 different scripts, one of them after another failing, including a script written for her by Singer himself. And she rejected that because it didn't give Yentl enough screen time. So this became her own passion project, and if you think about it, she's on the screen virtually every scene, which Singer, the author, then criticizes. He says, that's not a way to make a good movie, to have one character on the screen the whole time. And he said, when I wrote the short story, I never thought of Yentl as singing. That's a completely different passion than what I had in mind. I had in mind the passion for learning, which is a very real passion. Many of you understand that, right? Many of you have lived that. But the passion for learning is not the passion for singing. They're completely different passions. So Barbra Streisand has taken my short story and made it a vehicle for her talent. But my story is not meant to be a musical. But what he really disliked was the upbeat ending. Because imagine if the Titanic hadn't sunk. Okay, remember the movie Titanic? Remember how the female lead character is in the bow of the boat and she's looking like this? Remember that? So that's how Barbra Streisand ends up the movie. She's singing, "I'm going to America." Now, Isaac Bashevis Singer said, what would have happened to my Yentl had she gone to America in 1904? I'll tell you what would have happened to her. She would have worked in a sweatshop. Or maybe she would have managed to marry a guy who could eke out a halfway decent living, and they'd move to the Bronx, and they'd have a small apartment, and they'd get an ice box. Okay? Not an electric refrigerator, right? An ice box. That would be as high as they would rise. That's what would have happened to Yentl had she gone to America, not what Barbra Streisand has, singing, "Papa, hey, look at me now. Now I'm a happy person." I don't know if you ever heard a Yiddish song, "My Green Cousin." Zu mir ist gekommen a Cousina. Did you ever hear that? So, a cousin has come to me. Green means inexperienced. She doesn't know anything about American life. And she's just so full of vivaciousness. She's got, I'll give you the Yiddish, Bäckerlach wie heute Pomeranzen, cheeks like red apples, Fieselach, was betten sich zum Tanzen, feet that are just asking themselves to dance. She can't stop from dancing, and her cheeks are gorgeous rosy red. That's my grüne Cousina. But what happens to her? She goes to America, she ends up in a sweatshop, and all of her bloom is off the rose. It's a sad song. Die Grüne Cousina is the name of the song. That's what would have really happened to Yentl. She would have become the Grüne Cousina, not what Barbra Streisand made of her. So, how do I understand how the film has changed from the story and how the story has changed from the real history? Here's how I understand it. In America, and this is the last major point I'll make, in America, there have been different stages of what we call feminism. The first stage of feminism you could date starting in 1848 and culminating in 1920. In 1848 in upstate New York, there was something called the Seneca Falls Convention, where some leading American female intellectuals came up with the idea that women deserve the right to vote. They were called suffragettes because they lobbied for women's suffrage. By the way, something similar happened in England, too. There was also a women's suffrage movement in England in the early 1900s also. And in America, it took 3/4 of a century. And finally, in 1920, the US Congress passed the 19th Amendment, allowing adult women the right to vote on the same basis as adult men. So the first wave of American feminism culminated in 1920 with success, with legal enfranchisement of women. And then other things happened in the 1920s. Then there was the Great Depression, then there was the Second World War, and that energy of feminism was dissipated. It was rekindled in the early 1960s by a woman whose name I'm sure you know, and you've probably read her book, some of you, Betty Friedan. Remember that name? Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. Now, she was describing the plight of a generation of middle-class women. She wasn't talking about working class or impoverished women. She's talking about middle-class women who go to college, right? They go to a famous girls' school like Wellesley College or something like that. And they get these advanced degrees in literature, and then they're supposed to do precisely nothing with it. The real degree they're supposed to get is their MRS degree, right? And what are they going to do? Quote Shakespeare while they hoover the rug? Is that what their college education is meant to do, so that they can remember what they took as juniors and seniors in college when they have tea with the other suburban housewives? Is that all that their education is meant to be? So by the early 1960s, this generational malaise began to really register in American life. It coincided with some other moments of great social turmoil. There was, of course, the civil rights movement in America at the same time, in the sense that our Constitution tells us to have a more perfect union. And we don't yet have a more perfect union because so many of the members of our body politic are second class. So is that not a betrayal of what it means to be an American? That's the energy behind the civil rights movement. And the women's movement piggybacked on that, saying women are half of all Americans and they're being treated as second-class citizens. I want to tell you that in terms of pay scales, that was quite true. When my wife and I were first married, she worked in the publishing industry in New York City. She was a professional book reviewer for Doubleday Publishing Company. And the wages she earned were paltry, right? Really paltry. And it's because it was known as a woman's profession. So there was no apology for this. There was, the man is earning the living. What you're earning is pin money. So we don't have to give you that much. So the feminist revolution of the 1960s was not about legal equality, it was about substantive equality. If Walter Cronkite can be a news anchor man, Howard K. Smith can be a news anchor man, Chet Huntley and David Brinkley can be news anchor men, why can't Barbara Walters be a news anchor? Why can't women be astronauts? You know, it would make more sense because for every added pound that you have to lift into outer space, you need all that extra fuel. And a woman is as smart as a man and usually weighs less. The Soviets had female cosmonauts. They understood something we didn't understand. We didn't have a female astronaut until the 1970s. We had Sally Ride and Krista McAuliffe, and then Judith Resnick of blessed memory. She died in the Challenger disaster. Remember that? So that was what was going on in this era. Why can't women be doctors and not just nurses? Why can't a woman be Perry Mason and not just Della Reese? You understand? So that's what's going on in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and that's when Barbra Streisand is working so hard to make this story into a film. So my own interpretation of the story, of the film, is that this is her way of marrying the feminist revolution that she's part of. I mean, she's a participant in this, right? She's one of the first people who refused to bow to a male-dominated scale of beauty. Do you know that? And that's why Andy Warhol, the pop artist, featured Barbra Streisand in a series of paintings, because the male-dominated definition of beauty didn't take allowance of Barbra Streisand's nose. She had to have a nose job to be beautiful by conventional Marilyn Monroe standards, which were male-dominated standards. She refused to do it because she said it might ruin my singing voice. And my singing voice is what I cannot afford to have be compromised. So she made headlines by refusing her nose job. So Barbra Streisand was not only an icon of the era, she was actually a living model of this feminist revolution. So in my interpretation of the film, this living embodiment of feminism sees this story, which is not about feminism. It's about the unhappiness, the deep, deep unhappiness of a woman with the aspirations that were only available to men in her society. And Barbra Streisand says that's a natural fit for the world I'm living in. So she makes it into a film. Now, I think that the project is a very worthy one, and I think she has a glorious voice. Personally, I would have rather seen the film not be a musical. I would have rather seen a film that was truer to the story rather than what she made of it. So it's not my favorite film, but I regard these films the way a grandparent regards their grandchildren. You love something about each one, right? You don't say that's the grandchild I really love and that one I just tolerate. You wouldn't say that, not as a grandparent, right? So there's a lot that I love about the story, the film, especially her first song, Papa, Can You Hear Me? Now, I want to finish with two little points. There's a very fine woman I know in New Jersey who is the closest friend to another woman who's one of the lifelong friends of my wife and myself. And this other woman suffered from early onset dementia, various plaques in the brain and so on and so forth. And she's really doing very, very poorly. Every time we take a trip up to New Jersey or New York, take my daughter to the hospital, we stop and visit this lifelong friend of ours, and we take the other friend to go visit her, because the other friend doesn't drive. So the last time I took the other friend, whose name is Vida, to visit the friend who's afflicted. His name is Martha. And on the way back, I said, Vida, I know it's hard for you to get around because you don't drive. Would you like me to drive you to the cemetery where your parents are buried? She said, I would so much like that. I haven't seen their graves in too long. So I took Vida to her parents. I mean, I knew her parents. I knew her father anyway. I knew her father. He was a gifted comic book artist. And I once hired him for my daughter's birthday party. She was maybe 8 or 9. and he had all the little children, draw comic figures, and he made a comic book out of their productions. His name was Milton. So I took Vida to Milton's grave, and sure enough, Vida said, quoting from this film, "Papa, can you hear me?" So for me, that was the precious moment. Anyway, it's a weird film, but I hope I've made it at least a little bit more understandable for you, and I hope you've enjoyed our hour of thinking together. So thank you very much. Perhaps we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Yes, we do have some time. So as always, if you would raise your hand, and then I give you the microphone, and please state your name for the record.
Hi, I'm Larry Shepard. I'd like to know, when the Tsar policy you said was against the Jews, what was his reasoning?
Oh, his reasoning was anti-Semitism. Plain and simple, anti-Semitism. It was deeply ingrained in the Russian Orthodox Church, going back to the Middle Ages. In fact, I'll give you a striking fact. The Tsar was originally the head of a part of Russia centered in Moskva, Muscovy it was called. They never allowed Jews to live in Muscovy. In the 1770s, under the brilliant leadership of a female Tsarina named Catherine the Great, you might remember that name, Catherine the Great, Russia teamed up with the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia to invade and annex all of Poland. They wiped out the independent state of Poland. So the Russians decided then and there they weren't going to allow any Jews that they've just conquered to move into their Russian state. So they established an enormous ghetto called the Pale of Settlement. And the Jews under Tsarist rule were never allowed to leave that Pale of Settlement, except under one Tsar. His name was Alexander II. He was like the Abraham Lincoln of the Tsars. And so he cautiously let a few of there were very few wealthy Jews, but he let some of the wealthy ones in because he figured they would stimulate the economy that he was trying to do. And when they didn't automatically convert to Russian Orthodoxy, he stopped letting them in. So it was, honestly, it was just bigotry.
Another question or comment? Going once?
Uwe, do you recall what our next film is?
Yes, so our next film will actually be Driving Miss Daisy. So, and that will be on the 3rd of March. And we may not necessarily need a handout because Michael Panitz will then come on the 4th of March to lecture. So we hope that between showing the movie on the 3rd and then his lecture on the 4th, we all might still remember what the movie was about. But yes, it's Driving Miss Daisy. All right, one more time. We said going once, going twice. All right, apparently you have answered everything exhaustively. Let's give Dr. Panitz once more a hand.
Very good.